I'm Claire Parker from Celebrity Memoir Book Club, and today we have a very special event. I'm so excited. I got to sit down a few weeks ago with Kip Williams, who is the director of The Picture of Dorian Gray, currently on Broadway. When I saw The Picture of Dorian Gray, I was just so excited by it that I was desperate to speak with him. It brings to life the story that Oscar Wilde wrote 130 years ago using just a single actress, Sarah Snook, who you may know from Succession. She portrays, I believe, 26 characters throughout the play using the help of an agile camera crew and pre-recorded characters. She uses different outfit changes, different affects, different accents, and oftentimes the camera angle itself to denote the different people she's playing. Also on the stage with her is 5 giant screens which move, change aspect ratios, and portray different things from herself, but large, herself live in conversation with a pre-recorded version of herself from different angles, portraying different characters at the same time. They are different perspectives, different people, and they physically move and change size and dimension throughout the show, creating a very interesting experience that uses the technology that we have today. Kip comes from Australia, where he has directed and created and written many plays that deal with this idea of the many versus the one. One of his breakthrough plays took a monologue from Samuel Beckett called Not I, which is a single sentence and a monologue, a single person, and he had it portrayed by 20 different people. So one character, 20 actors. He then put on a triptych of Gothic plays. He did The Picture of Dorian Gray, Dracula, and then Jekyll and Hyde. He ultimately brought The Picture of Dorian Gray to the East End in London, where then he brought it to New York City. This is the first place where he's collaborated with Sarah Snook, and it has just been announced that he will create Dracula with just the actress Cynthia Erivo and his screens. And without further ado, Kip, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being here. And I want to get started. What led you back to the text originally? Why now? I saw that you read about it in high school. I think we all kind of considered ourselves, we're like, oh, a witty guy. That's sort of me too. But what led you back to it many years later?
I came back to it a number of times over the years since first reading it when I was about 14, 15 years old. But about seven or so years ago, I came back and read a whole host of Gothic texts, in part because I was fascinated with that period of literature and the way that the writers of that time period wrote these extraordinary kind of allegorical tales that, are fecund for reinterpretation, and particularly because it's a time in which those artists are grappling with a host of questions that I think are having their kind of apotheosis in the times in which we're living. And when I read Dorian, I was deeply struck by how prophetic it felt. Really felt like he was writing about today, this world that's obsessed with beauty and youth and material gain, but also a world that is acutely aware of its the ask that it places on people to perform their identity. I don't think Wilde could have foreseen how prolific that act of performance would become in the manifestation of the mobile phone and social media, but he knew that we were spiraling towards this world of solipsism and narcissism, and so when I read the story, I was like, well, this is the perfect tale to explore those ideas and the questions that come from them.
And the use of technology in the pre-recordings, how did you envision that? How did it come together? Did you just see it all at once in your head, or what was the experience of bringing it to life and collaborating?
It was pretty, one of those rare experiences, I think, artistically. Like, often my process is driven by, a kind of deep reading of the text over and over again to sort of crack a theatrical form that's going to, in and of itself, be an expression of the story. That's sort of how I like to work. That's my general process. But from time to time, you do get struck with a bigger vision. And it's nice when the muses visit you in that way. But they did on this one. I read it and immediately conceived of a production that would be one performer playing all of the roles, that there would be video and this very particular relationship to camera being the manifestation of both audience and the portrait watching performer and Dorian, and saw a number of sequences off the bat, like dinner party and the club sequence using face filters and even the kind of open Brechtian language of, change camera, simple proper gesture, change character. And then, I was terrified by that vision because it was breaking my number one rule as a director who had used video for about 5 years in my practice at that point, which was that all of the video has to be live. There's to be no pre-record. And I knew that this particular conception would involve pre-record. So I sort of put the idea at the very back of my brain and said, no, don't do this. This is it's too scary. But it persisted and niggled and became an idea that I had to pursue. And that's sort of when you know that that there's something in it where it becomes undeniable in your mind. So I took the leap of faith and began writing the adaptation and worked with an amazing team of designers, and Marg Hall did the set and costumes, Clarence Williams did sound design, Nick Schlieper, the lighting designer, Dave Bergman, video designer, and then amazing group of collaborators, and off we went.
I mean, the choreography of it, how much of the decisions of who shows up where, like, how much of it are you able to preconceive versus how much are you there with the head of tech and with your actor and figuring it out live beat by beat?
It's a really good question, and slightly different from show to show, but in Dorian I came in with a very kind of clear concept for how each scene was going to work. And in some instances, say Take the Dinner Party, that's pretty straightforward in terms of how I see it. It's like, well, it's going to be a 1-to-1 ratio. I know how the camera is going to have to operate in order to shoot that, etc. In other instances, so like the opening chapter, the very sort of first half of that was very clear in my head, sort of storyboarded, you could say. But then once the performer leaves the chair and, that evolves, I work very quickly to choreograph and block the camera, and that's something that I do. I don't know why I can do that quickly, but I can, and I love it. So in that sense, there's this sort of really appropriately Wildian paradox between sort of very high preconception, considered rigor, and then wanting to be alive to the truth that's being generated by the actor. And then very quickly I make a decision about where the camera is going to go in response to that, which sort of means that we are able to make these shows in sort of relatively the same footprint that you'd make a standard piece of theatre, even though we're doing all of the pre-record in that time period as well. It's kind of an insane marathon, but it's a lot of fun.
I feel like the pre-recorded works so well with the themes of Dorian Gray, because when you're there, I watched it, I think, in previews, and then I came back a month or two later with my in-laws and saw it again with them, and I was struck by this idea of like, oh, Sarah has aged but her pre-recordings haven't. But where do you think the limit is with being able to use technology in pre-recording and have it still be live theater? I think right now with like the AI conversations, do you have like a running philosophy on when it stops being truly live theater?
Yeah, I actually really do. I have two kind of strong guiding principles that inform all of the work I make, and I also direct work that has no cameras within it, and all of the work that I make in the theatre prescribes these two principles, which are the theme that separates theatre from other narrative art forms. Those two principles are that it takes place in space and it takes place in time. The film is a two-dimensional narrative art form, and you can pause it. Same with television. And the novel takes place in your mind, and again you can pause it. But a piece of theatre is a set temporal experience, so it's live, and it is the thing that really defines theatre from other narrative art forms is that it takes place in space. And so one of the things that drives my use of camera and screens is that it has a very deeply spatial relationship to both the performer and to the audience. And the screens are deployed in a very kinetic way that has a dramaturgy to it that helps tell the stories. I'm quite averse to using theatre that uses screens in a way that is a sort of addendum of information, or sort of deploys that sort of emotionally two-dimensional cinematic version. You'll note in Dorian and in other works of mine, the screens operate in a way where they're like a performer. They are spatially acting and interacting with that performer, and then dramaturgically impacting the spatial storytelling as well. So key moments, for example, big one is when Lord Henry comes to tell Sybil Vane that Sybil is dead, and you have the live performer Sarah on stage as this tiny figure, dwarfed by this giant Lord Henry. And that spatial relationship of Lord Henry to performer and also to audience has the impact of dominating the space that gives him that power and authority that is requisite in that moment of storytelling, that moment of influence and sophistry and manipulation. So those two principles, it must be live and it must be spatially driven, drive everything I do, and particularly with this use of technology. And so to your question about the use of pre-record, the reason why it works and the reason why I was able to sort of break my number one rule is because it's always in tandem with the live experience. And in fact, the most purest form of the cinetheatre that is expressed within Dorian are frames where you have Sarah live on stage and you can see her juxtaposed with a screen where she is live within that screen and also pre-recorded within the very same frame. They are technically extremely complex to render live every night, but we pull it off with the work of Sarah and an amazing crew and an amazing team to make that happen. But it is the very liveness that sits at the center of those moments that pre-record. And so in that sense, and it was a big question you asked me, so forgive the big answer.
No, please.
With this question around AI, and technology in theatre, like Dorian is an interesting case in point because I think for all its contemporary technology, it's fundamentally built upon a very analog, ancient form of storytelling, which is a single actor coming to an audience to tell you a story. That's a form of storytelling as old as time itself. And that is the through line through the entire piece. You are live connected to Sarah, who is directly telling you that story, inviting your imagination into the story to make it real, much like having a parent or a grandparent read you a story where they're putting on all the voices. And the production starts and ends in that very stripped back Brechtian language where literally it's performer and audience who are making the entire story world real. And I think that's what makes it work. It's connected to that ancient form. But I also think, that we can have a lot of moral panic around the use of technology and art in general. And there is a central part of it which is deeply concerning and warranted, which is about actually having human being artists making the work when it comes to the question of AI. But when it simply comes to the question of technology in general, I'm of the belief that human beings have used technology in live storytelling since the dawn of time. But we used fire, and we still do use fire to create shadows and images. We've always used technology. We always will use technology. I find it ironic where people are like, I just want an empty stage and an actor in a chair. It's like it literally Dorian starts that way. But it's like, yes, I do too. I make lots of theatre that way. But also, do you realize that the lighting rig that's lighting that performer is using technology that didn't exist 20 years ago? Like, we're using technology, like the comms that allow our stage managers to call the cues. We have to use it. We should incorporate it. And as long as it is staying true to the principles of the art form, that it's a temporally contained art form, it's live, and that it's a spatially driven art form, then it will always have a place. And if I can say one other thing in the longest answer, I had this great lunch the other day with a novelist who was talking about the resistance that a lot of writers have to putting mobile phones into the novel. She said this great sentence. She was like, it obliterating and ignoring the presence of that technology in our lives, in the stories that we're telling, is akin to writing stories in the age of aeroplanes where we say that there's only like horse and buggies that are getting us from place to place. It's like this is in our lives. It has transformed our lives. It has transformed how time and space work within all forms of narrative art. But to obliterate it and to say it doesn't exist, I think, is to deny a central part of human existence that's going on. And I think one of the things that's so thrilling about seeing audiences on Broadway respond to Dorian is that it's a story that's 135 years old, but utterly speaking to the way in which our lives are unfolding today and how central this is to that existence.
I completely understand. It feels like what was so powerful about your play was the way that it felt so contemporary. I made a lot of people go and I told them I'll read the book first so that you can kind of keep up. And they were all, I think a lot of them felt shocked at how relevant the screens were able to make it feel to their lives, even if the book had felt a bit Victorian to them. Like, it emphasized the live performance because you're kind of on the edge of your seat the whole time, worried about how it's going to be pulled off. And I think that first time she kind of has a conflict with like who gets to narrate it, she's up against herself on screen. You have this feeling of like, what if she trips? What if she coughs? And I have to ask, technically, what kind of room for error is there?
In another appropriate Wildian paradox, there is very little room for error, but there's also a lot of room for error. Because it is all happening live, and some of the things that Sarah pulls off are so kind of incomprehensible that some people can't even believe that she's doing it live, like the face tuning elements of the show. Some people go, "Oh yeah, that's someone doing that off stage, right?" I've had so many people say that to me. It's like, nope, that is Sarah doing 32 different filters whilst delivering dense Oscar Wilde text, and then detuning that image. That is her doing that live every night, and if it would sort of die if it wasn't live. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's no, in a piece that is all about the oscillation between artifice and reality, between truth and fiction of who we are, the whole thing is motored by constantly juxtaposing the artifice, the construction, with the illusion on the screen. So it has to be motored and motivated by that potential for the artifice to unravel. Otherwise, the whole conceit of the piece doesn't work. And I love that element about it because there's sort of two things that come from it. In the room of human error within it is that almost vaudevillian or circus-like tightrope walk energy that you cannot get from any other art form other than live theatre. And it generates a sort of presence within the audience that is sort of unmatched, I think, in any other art form. And I love that about it. And then the other element, and this is sort of, speaks to one of the influences on the piece. One of the first things I showed to Sarah was Sally Potter's adaptation of Virginia Woolf's Orlando, the film that she made with Tilda Swinton, where Swinton constantly breaks the fourth wall and looks into camera. Not only is that sort of the big generative inspiration point for the show's relationship to camera, it's sort of this very theatrical, almost sort of Shakespearean aside notion of a complicit relationship between performer and audience. It also speaks to the subversive kind of, queer Oscar Wilde spirit of the piece, where Sarah is encouraged to make that connection to the audience. You are brought inside the production by the wink of the eye. You are constantly having the artifice punctured for you and shown that it's not real. And so in that sense, if anything does go awry, there is a rule within the piece that Sarah can talk to the audience. She can ad-lib a joke about a mishap that may happen. And it's that acknowledgement of the construction that I think not only, as I said, speaks to the themes, but underscores that this incredibly technically complex work that's filled with a myriad of details is also a living, breathing theatrical organism, and that the audience is witnessing it come to life in that very moment.
For me, one of the impacts of your version of Dorian Gray was, I think, the first time I read it, I had the real sense of the dangers of pursuing beauty, the hedonism. I think what your show brought alive for me was this kind of like secondary danger of influence. I think I'm on TikTok a lot. I was very struck by, of course, the use of the word influence. And I would like to read a quote for the audience straight from, "There's no such thing as a good influence, because to influence a person is to give him one's own soul. He does not think his natural thoughts or burn with his natural passions. His virtues are not real to him. His sins, if there are such a thing as sins, are borrowed. He becomes an echo of someone else's music, an actor of the part that he has not been written for him." In my personal life, I was very there was a TikTok conversation going on about, are influencers boring? And so I had this laugh about the question of influencers and what happens when you're watching some girl from the West Village drink matcha. And I'm like, we were warned 130 years ago. That's actually a quite boring thing to do, to be watching other people live their life and trying to live like them. And I think something that your play did for me is it took Dorian Gray from being this idea of like the duality, him and his portrait, to kind of almost the multiplicity of selves.
Yes.
And, there's literally, the actor playing Dorian Gray is playing all of the influences upon Dorian Gray. And this way you're seeing them codified on the screen as these externalized versions of who you've become, how that kind of chips away at your soul. I know that this is a theme that you're interested in. I was reading about how you took one monologue and spread it over 20 people. I know you're doing Dracula next, another interest in the dark within us. And then Jekyll and Hyde is, of course, the ultimate two-sided story. I'm interested in what you think are the nuanced differences in all those themes of the differences of like the two versus the many.
It's amazing to hear you reflect it back to me. Thank you.
Do you feel that the technology was able to add that, or is that something that you were trying to get across?
All what you've said is really gratifying and thrilling to hear, because it's a lot of how I relate to the piece as well. And the technology deployed is central to achieving that. Not only in a sort of technical sense that it permits this splitting of the individual formally, but as we talked about, the way in which it reflects how we are splitting ourselves today. And, it's a story about, Wilde talks about the three central characters being these three different iterations of his own self, that Lord Henry is who he is thought of as being, that Dorian is who he fantasizes about being, and that Basil the painter is who he probably actually is, his vulnerable self. And within just simply that triptych is that notion of the multiple self, and the challenge we face as human beings to live authentically, and depending on your context and your authentic identity, we at times need to, and I think a lot of queer people are very attenuated to this, and certainly I am myself. There's contexts in which you have to, you feel you have to conceal a part of yourself in order to survive and protect yourself. And so as a result, you get very good at reading the way in which people are doing that in the world. But we do it in all, manner of complex, nuanced ways. To your point about technology, what's so interesting is that this age of, like, performing identity is not new. That's an essential human phenomenon. We have to do it in order to express ourselves to other people. But we've never had to do it in a virtual space until quite recently. And we've never had to do it so prolifically and regularly as we are doing it today as a result of the mobile phone and social media. And the issue or the challenge that is confronted to us outside of the innate human challenge of expressing and navigating the multiple selves in the real world is doing that in a virtual space, where it is predisposed to simple narratives, where it is predisposed to curation, where it is predisposed to presenting the airbrushed version of self. And I think there's this sort of like odd feedback loop that then happens where the performed virtual self becomes the person who we feel we need to be in real life as well. It's sort of like damaging echo chamber and hole of mirrors that we end up living within, which is very much what happens to Dorian by the end of the piece, and it is expressed visually in the production with the perpetual splitting of Dorian at the end, and sort of a tragic, inescapable house of mirrors that Dorian ends up in by the end of the piece. And this question of influence is a great question. I have not been asked very much about this in the process of making this work. It's a really exciting theme to delve into, because part of the influence at play is sort of the proliferation of external sources of information that we are living with today, and there's great virtues to that. Like, I am not just a purely anti-social media, anti-mobile phone human being by any stretch of the imagination. And I think there are great virtues in the virtual as well. It has allowed disparate minorities to coalesce in a virtual space and be heard. Like, there's been certain progresses in like, say, queer rights and trans rights as a result of that. But it's also there are platforms that are predisposed to simplize over complex truth. It's not a platform of complexity. It's not a platform of nuance. So the influences that we get are often homogenized, and they're mixing within this milieu of the curated self, rather than the complex self. And I do worry about that. But I also think, like, and it goes back to Wilde's, one of Wilde's influences on the novel is the Faust Mephistopheles myth, and obviously Lord Henry is the sort of Mephistopheles figure within the piece. And there is a little Easter egg in the show, which some people may have clocked, but when Dorian runs home from the theatre and lands back in his apartment, he lands with a portrait of Faust playing chess with Mephistopheles behind him. Those looking for little Easter eggs in the show. But that question of influence, I think, is really interesting, because we want to, particularly in this day and age, we want to eschew responsibility for our actions. We want to say it wasn't me, particularly in the age of narcissism that we're living within. Narcissism is an innate part of all human beings to an extent, but it's being blown out of the water right now in our life. And part of that is sort of an eschewment of responsibility, of moral responsibility, and we wish to sort of externalize that and say it's not me, or I was told, or so on and so forth. Like, one of the things that's specific in this adaptation, more pointed, is the choice Dorian faces a third of the way through the story between a philosophy of authenticity and complexity and greyness that Sybil Vane offers, and a philosophy of sophistry, of self-servance, of solipsism that Henry offers. And Dorian ultimately chooses Henry, and he doesn't have to. And yes, he is gaslit by Henry, and yes, he is manipulated by Henry and pressured by Henry. And the piece looks at the damage that such relationships can have upon your life. But ultimately, I think Wilde says that you may be able to fool everyone around you from taking moral responsibility for your actions, but you cannot escape your own self. Your portrait in your attic will know what you have done. Always be accountable to that truth of what you know you've done. And I kind of love that as a relatively objective moral provocation to grapple with in 2025, in this time where, our very notion of what's true has been so upended by various politicians, and a kind of radical rewiring of how human beings communicate with each other, which has led to this proliferation of misinformation and sophistry in our lives. It's so easy today to construct an argument that what I think this, or I don't take responsibility for this because it was something else. And I love that 135 years ago, Wilde very honestly confronted his own morality and said, at the end of the day, you are morally accountable to yourself, and you cannot escape that truth. And I love that.
I mean, I find that to be really hopeful. You know what I mean? That's like a really optimistic view. Like, I think I look at things like cancel culture and things online, and I feel like we're all living in this world right now of fear that the other side won't be held accountable. That we're like, I feel like there's such a feeling of like, looking at someone like Trump and being like, is there a portrait of, like, will he, you know what I mean? Will there ever be that moment of like kind of agnoresis where he wakes up and goes, I've been wrong. And I'm like, I mean, it's a beautiful idea that every day, one day someone will feel guilty for what they deserve to feel guilty for.
Yeah. And, that's like, Dorian starts as this sort of like beautiful, naive, open soul. I think what Basil falls in love with is equal parts, obviously Basil's deeply physically attracted to Dorian, but he falls in love with this sort of light that he says it was almost as if he had a light shining from within. There is this openness, and it is tragic that the naivety of Dorian leads him to be so vulnerable to the manipulation of Harry. I think that's really clear within the story, but that's in sort of one narrative layer. If you look at it more complexly, in how Wilde saw the story and how this production sees the story, as Harry being another function of the mind of the same being, which you physically experience in this production when you see Sarah playing both roles. It's the same person talking to themselves. If you read the narrative as that psychological dialogue that's at play in one person's mind, it does something different to how we all can navigate more complexly our relationship to our own actions, our own sort of moral accountability with our own actions. Mm-hmm. Because we all have the Harry in our mind that says, it wasn't your fault. Mm-hmm. She's just an actress and who was flitting through, she was just a character. She's as much just a character as the people she was playing on stage. Don't worry about it. Like, it becomes, I think, more psychologically interesting when you do read the story as the characters being different facets of the one being, mm-hmm. and how we share internally that question of how we're going to live, who we're going to be, and the responsibility we're going to take for what we do.
Well, I think something unique to now, we've always been performing different versions of ourselves. You never treated your mom the same way you treated your boyfriend. But for the first time, we all have this ability to confront the artifice. And I don't know if you've ever experienced putting out a video and then having to watch yourself later and be like, I fucking hate that. But like, I sometimes scroll through my phone and hear my own voice and I'm like, who is that whiny, awful? I think the show captures that. The fact that we right now, because of technology, are actually having to look at and be forced to almost remember who we were always pretending to be, having to see something you posted a few years ago and be like, no, I didn't. I was never that corny. I was never that hack. It brings new horror.
I love that you sort of pointed out this sort of past relationship to self as well, because the notion of the human being, this sort of static form that doesn't evolve. I don't know, it's this sort of like very 20th century, like, almost sort of Chekhovian patriarchal notion of how the psyche works, sort of Stanislavskian idea of like the unity of interior desire and exterior action. It's like, that is not how human beings work. We not only want like 50 things at any one point in time, but often those things completely contradict each other and they will change. Mm-hmm. And who you were 10 years ago will, I hope, be different from who you are today. And to your sort of experience of hearing your own voice in a video, I mean, we were not evolved as beings. Our own voices in the videos, and to hear them in the way that we hear, that we all hear them today, and all, see ourselves. I mean, I'm not looking at myself right now, but there is a tiny little. I'm looking at myself right now if I wanted to. We're so confronted. Mm-hmm. We're not only having to perform, we're confronted with our own performance in a way. So we're sort of like directing ourselves and giving ourselves notes in this insanely nuanced way. Even yesterday, someone was saying to me that she texts. Like, I love your analogy of like, you talk to your mother differently from how you talk to your boyfriend. It's like, yeah, you do. Like, you have a different energy when you're hanging out with your friends who you grew up with when you're 5 years old from your friends who you've met at work, and that is not being inauthentic. That's being a human being. That is the beautiful dance of the complex selves that exist within us. But this notion that like we can not only do we have to perform in the abstract space, but we have to watch it as well and be so hyper aware of it. I don't know. I think I worry about that. Yeah. I think, it is the beauty of theatre is that it asks 1,000 strangers to come into a dark room and to collectively do something together. It's like you bring a love film, and I obviously love film, some of the theatre work that I make, but you bring 1,000 people into a film and you press play on that film is not going to be changed by whether the 1,000 people in that room are invested, focused, listening. They all get up and left. That film's still playing. The piece of theatre only exists. It's an immensely abstract art form. Even the most naturalistic piece of theatre on stage, like that has a fully realized set, is not real. Yeah. You are in theatre. You are like 20 meters away from the street where you can hear the New York cop cars zooming past. Like, it is not real. It is only made real by us all deciding to make it real. And I love that about theatre, because it's 1,000 different people coming together who don't know each other, collectively doing that together. And for me, the best pieces of theatre make that imaginative leap as big as possible. Mm-hmm. That's where this interaction starts. It's an empty space, asks entirely for the audience's imagination. But my point that I'm making is that we get so much more from in-person interaction. Like, I love what the internet's done. You know, we might not be able to be having this conversation if we didn't have Zoom. Mm-hmm. And I love that. There's so many virtues from it. But there's a balance that we need to strike within our lives, and the ability to be present and to be vulnerable in the space of another human being feels to be increasingly diminishing at an alarming rate. And I think the only path that leads to is increasingly dehumanized way in which we communicate with each other. Just in the most simple, crude, obvious way, the way people talk about each other online, they would never say that to someone's face. And it's because when you're in the presence of another human being, there is this innate acknowledgement of your own humanity and empathy that is brought forth. The thing I find so tragic about Dorian is that he loses his empathy as a result of what the portrait offers him, an unchecked ego. Mm-hmm. And it results in very dehumanized behavior towards other people. Like, his behavior towards Alan Campbell is unspeakable. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the few examples, Little and Sybil Vane, that we get to witness within the play. And I think there's a lot that we can take from that in what Wilde is revealing to us as to what happens to us when we lose sense of that ability to empathize and connect with other people.
I mean, just talking even a little bit off topic about what we allow beautiful people to do. I sent my friend saw the play on Wednesday, and she came back and she goes, all I could think about was like a Johnny Depp, a Brad Pitt, and the way we allow beautiful men to get away with anything, because we're like, well, but they're so charming, they're so attractive. And it was almost shocking to me to think of like how literal of an example that is. I'm like, that's so true. We let these.
Isn't there like a fact where like good looking people are like earn 20% more than...
or like people think they're more trustworthy. It is crazy how true it is. You kind of think of Dorian Gray as almost a parody, but it's really not. What a beautiful, especially for boys, because I think as a woman I'm always thinking of a beautiful woman and the double-edged sword that is, but then you see a beautiful man and you're like, well, that seems awesome. That seems like how you win the game scot-free. I want to talk to you about what you've done with gender in your performance, because of course Dorian Gray pretty gay in the grand scheme of things, and your choice to have a woman, did you always want it to be an actress, or what was the decision to have a woman play these mostly male, very gay characters?
Yeah, I mean, as like a gay queer person myself, you know, one of the things I love about the novel is its queerness. Mm-hmm. It was part of my queer awakening, reading this novel as a teenager, you know, who was at a all-boys school and had just performed in a production of The Importance of Being Earnest, where I played Cecily Cardew. You know, so my whole portal into Oscar Wilde was through the experience of performing gender, and I wanted to play her for the truth of who she was, both her gendered experience and her experience as a human in this story about, again, the tension between truth and lies and authenticity and artifice. So that was an amazing portal through which to enter into Wilde's body of work. When it came to years later, turning Dorian into a piece of theatre was an immediate instinctual choice for me. Mm-hmm. It does about 70 things within the show, and so I'm always hesitant to kind of completely say everything that I think it does, because I want audience members to have their own relationship to it. But the very first thing it does is completely foreground for the audience this performance of gender in the piece. And we all perform gender, irrespective of our gender identity. It's one of the central ways in which we communicate our identity to the world around us is our gendered experience. And so this, you know, the piece is a drag act, and a very foreshadowed, foregrounded one in the first third to half of the piece. So there's kind of two things are happening. There's this story where the characters are ostensibly male, although queer male characters, and Dorian, I think, has an element of being non-binary to my instinct when I read the piece, but for all intents and purposes is read as male, who are having these queer attractions between them, these homoerotic attractions. But then you have in the theatre meta layer a cisgendered woman performing these male characters, and so that the kind of performance of gender is made manifest in the theatre making, which foregrounds the way in which these queer male characters have to perform ideas of gender themselves. There's also some kind of, I find, problematic behavior from Lord Henry, some sexist and misogynist behavior that he espouses within the piece.
Something I was thinking about when I was preparing for this interview was the irony of how much they are telling Dorian Gray, your number one value is your beauty, and then how mean they are to him for being like, oh, do you only like Sybil Vane because she's beautiful? She's not even I'm like, why can't she just be a dumb idiot? Dorian's the dumbest idiot there is.
Right?
That's not fair.
Entire way in which Harry and Basil are dismissive of Sybil Vane's talent is laden with this undercurrent of misogyny, as is sort of Harry's initial assumption that she'll be of no worth to begin with. So having Sarah play those roles offers a critical perspective upon that particular gendered attitude inside the narrative itself. The thing that I'm most proud of, without wanting to talk to all the things, but obviously there is this grappling between the narrator character and Dorian that emerges over the course of the first half of the play as to who's getting to tell the story. First, the narrator starts arguing with herself, and then she starts arguing with Dorian. And then by the time you hit the middle of the piece, which is sort of the time jump moment where we go jump 18 years in Dorian's life, we aesthetically jump 135 years with the introduction of the mobile phone and the contemporary music and contemporary costumes from Clements and Marg. But at that moment, the narrator and Dorian, without the audience realizing it, allied with one another. They become one and the same person. And the narrator will not reveal themselves again until the very, very final moment of the show with the wig reveal. And so at that moment, the piece shifts from a kind of interrogation of gender binary by the drag act in the first half of the piece to what I find to happen that I'm most proud of, particularly as a queer person, is that Dorian's gender in this elision between the two is both male and female and non-binary. And from that point, irrespective of your gender identity, audience members can find themselves within Dorian Gray. And all of my work espouses a non-binary philosophy on gender. It's how I view the world, and it's how I engage with gender. I think there are multiple gender experiences, and I firmly believe that and express that within my work. And it's a fascination of mine that I interrogate in the work that I make. And yeah, without wanting to say too much more about how I see gender operating within the piece, that's the element of it that applies to me.
I have to say, as a woman watching it, and I'm in the entertainment industry, I felt what she was able to do in the 4K of looking at her. Right now, I think we're in such an era of this idea of you are not optimizing and flattening and getting your face as tight and poreless as humanly possible. You don't even have a shot to prove your talent. Like, first and foremost, you must look a certain way. And I feel that every day on TikTok, I could be talking about famine and somebody's like, bestie, your eyebrows aren't looking good. And it's like the way that right now more than ever, it's like you have to look the certain way before you're even allowed to showcase what you've been working on. To see her with a fully movable face just do this tour de force performance that I'm like, it felt like such a fuck you to Hollywood and the standards that women are both forced to have, but also put on it's easy to get wrapped up in like, oh no, I'm getting Botox for the art. No, you're not. You could like look at what she's doing. She's doing more than anybody else right now. And it's not vain, her performance. She's incredibly like physical and she's moving and she's making funny faces, and you know what I mean? I see, like, you see inside her nose at one point. It really, I think, sends home this message of how ridiculous our obsession with beauty is.
It is. And Sarah would never say this about herself, but she's also an incredibly beautiful human being. She completely lacks vanity in both life and her art. She's interested in the ideas and full embodiment of the characters she has to play, which is one of the reasons why she's the genius artist that she is. And if the production is not in any way anti-plastic surgery, if people want to do that, that's like all power to people. But it is definitely looking at the pressure behind that, the pressure of the beauty culture, and packing the mask that it creates, and acknowledges the role that it plays in that act of performance. It's really, really interesting to continue to put this narrative in front of audiences and, particularly in the center of the production, arrive them in that moment of being confronted with that part of what we're able to do today it's fascinating to see how people respond to
It's
that.
really, it felt very effective. It felt like a real wake up call and a kind of a fuck you to anything you're telling yourself about how much tightening you have to be constantly doing in the pursuit of tight. But I have a certain moment in the play that I have you shed light on. The song break.
Yes.
That was the one moment I feel like, I was very interested. I'm like, I think I could sit down and kind of decode when Dorian's head is in the flowers and you first see the blue glove, or even I love when he's alone in the woods. And am I right in saying that's the only time he's unmediated by screens and he's kind of reckoning with himself alone? And then I was like, okay, these I get, but I was like, the song break felt truly like something I didn't see coming, and I'm startled by, and I would love to hear the thinking behind it.
These sort of moments of magic that you, like theatre magic that you identify, the hand on the shoulder, etc. They always correlate dramaturgically at a point in time where either Dorian is being seduced into a particular way of thinking. So the hand on the shoulder comes when Lord Henry plants the, pursue a life of youth and beauty and pleasure and self-gratification.
Literally plants. I guess his head's in a plant. He's
so correlates with that act of seduction. The motive of Gorgeous, the lip sync, I knew that I wanted, when I was writing it and conceiving the direction of it, I knew I wanted there to be a lip sync there, and I wrote in the script a lip sync where Dorian cleans up the murder scene and ends up at the front door so he can create an alibi. I'll describe what I think it does functionally before I tell you how I found that song. But functionally, what it does is, he's just murdered Basil, his best friend, and he's done so in hot blood, heated exchange, but it is the most kind of morally corrupt action that he has enacted by quite a bit up until that point in the story. So there's an extent to which audience members would feel justified to say, well, I disown you, I don't associate with you anymore, I don't want to have anything to do with you. And with the lip sync, within 90 seconds of him murdering his best friend, the audience is giving him a round of applause and cheering. And so he has seduced the audience right back into his pocket and is then able to take them into the next section of the piece where it really starts to spiral and unravel.
Well, I've had that feeling of being there, like we've just had such a climax, and then watching it the second time, I was like, but I know there's so much more to go. And it felt like this moment of how do you diffuse the emotional tension without kind of bringing down the energy that you've just built with a full murder. But that is so, like, I hadn't even picked up on that he's a murderer that we love now. A dazzling little murderer.
The audience screams with applause 90 seconds after he's murdered his best friend. So there's that sort of dramaturgical function to it. And look, there are other kind of, in terms of the emotional, psychological landscape of the piece, a couple other things it's doing. But in terms of the song, I was like, I don't know what that song is. And I sort of had some sort of nascent ideas. I was like, what is it going to be? What's it going to be? And it was like 1 o'clock at night, and I had just finished doing some writing on the script. And I got into bed, and my partner was scrolling through Instagram, and he follows this amazing trans drag queen called Juno Birch, who does this sort of like 60s alien drag. It's really cool. And she had these videos that he was watching, and at the top of one of them was the first like 4 chords or something of Gorgeous, like not the singing or anything, but just the horns section that Clements Williams, the sound designer, reworks into the stabbing, which you will note that the reworking of the 4 seasons that she does in the stabbing sequences in a different key from Gorgeous, and so in order for that to work on each stab, Clemmy changes the key a semitone. It's very clever. But I heard those 4 chords and I was like, what is that piece of music? And he's like, I don't know, I'm just looking at this at Junior Birch. And I Shazammed it, and it was Gorgeous from the Apple Tree. And I listened to it, and it's this 90-second song that lyrically perfectly sums up the unchecked ego and narcissism of Dorian Gray, that is sort of so out of control at that point in the narrative. And I was like, here we go. That's why we get the rots. And
that has to be the most validating feeling as a music writer, to be like the 4 notes you were able to predict but like then for the lyrics and the notes to match so perfectly, they really conveyed something. I I think we're almost out of time. So I just have a couple of fun, quick questions. Right now, I feel like you seem interested in doubles. It seems like socially there's a big interest in doubles right now. Do you think there's any pieces of current media that you find are the most in conversation with what you're trying to do right now?
Oh, probably TikTok. That's a good question. I haven't seen Sinners yet, which I hear is fantastic and has some. And I've heard the television series that Rachel Weisz does, where she plays like I think an identical twin. I'd be quite keen to see that. But the big touchstone of inspiration for some of that in Dorian is a Michel Gondry music video for Kylie Minogue called "Come Into My World." So if anyone listening hasn't seen that before, it's on YouTube and it's a masterpiece.
And do you have any recommendations if people love your work? You would be like, then definitely check out this book, this movie. I think we've named some, but
Michel Gondry's music videos, definitely for Kylie, but also for Chemical Brothers, Let Forever Be. His work with Björk and Radiohead. Spike Jonze's Björk Oh So Quiet is a big, music. Gorgeous is sort of quite inspired by the fantastical music theatre number emerging from the everyday in that sense. Sally Potter's Orlando, Hitchcock's Vertigo, the cinematography of Denis Villeneuve, the rhythmic shape of Steve McQueen's Hunger. Then there's just too many to mention.
Do you have a general routine of how you are so prolific? Do you have a how I get it done type morning routine?
Oh, I'm a morning person. I wish I was. I feel like the best ideas come at like 1 o'clock in the morning. But what would my sort of routine advice be? I mean, I think for young aspiring directors, I would say don't sit on your ideas for too long. Do them. I sort of feel like an artist's mind is a bit like a fridge, and you can store ideas within it. But like any food, it can go off over time if you don't use it and make something from it. So I would say act now and I guess I am still relatively prolific, but when I was in my early 20s and sort of in my teens, like I was just making as much as I could, and you really directing is something that you can only really do. You can only really become a director through the intense doing of it. You can't. It's so hard to. You can do as sort of much theoretical training as you want, but the actual physical hours of doing it, it's the way to lock your voice within it.
And do you have any advice on how people, when you were a teen, I assume you didn't have a budget, maybe you did, but any advice on people who are like feeling like they need to wait for some gatekeeper to give them the permission?
I mean, it's a hard road towards a budget, and life is filled with luck, and anybody who has a successful career has benefited from lots of luck in their life, and I can attest to that. But I think you need to be ready and prepared for when those moments come, so that when they do, and they will, you can act upon them and deliver. But the beauty of theatre, and I suppose going back to kind of the Peter Brook notion of the empty space, is that you can create profound poetic art with very, very little. Because your greatest tool is your audience's imagination, and you can't really do that with film. You can't. You need a lot more. Whereas with theatre, you need actors and an empty space, and then it's about imaginatively how you generate the story within that space. So I would like definitely work towards budgets, because over Dorian is the culmination of 10 years of working with video, where kind of like every production, if it didn't work, I wouldn't have been able to make the next one. So there is that kind of pressure of like, if you're going to push the boundaries and move into using sort of bigger, more demanding, costly technologies, it's a big climb to get there. But that's not where I started. I started using a couple of chairs and a bed sheet to create multiple different universes. Like that is the same skill base that I draw upon now in creating the works that I make in much larger context. So this get into a space. If you're still in high school or at university, get permission to use the hall of a classroom after hours and push the desks aside and use the space and think about all the different ways you can use space to tell story, because that is what the art form is about.
Oh my God. Well, thank you so much. This has been just an amazing conversation. I really appreciate the time.
Thanks very much. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for coming and seeing the show twice as well, and for your insights on it. It's amazing to talk with you about it.
Thank you.